For this year's Backyard History Christmas episode, we're going to war. We're going to go back to the Second World War, into the places that were often forgotten, or at least glossed over, where Canadians fought. First, Northern Africa, and then in Italy. And we are going to follow the adventures of a man who everyone believes is dead, yet who came home for Christmas. And also, if you're looking for Christmas presents, for something to add to your list or to get for someone else's lists, there are now 4 backyard history books, and you can order signed copies of them from me directly at backyardhistory.ca. And you know what? There's this strange thing about the sales in my online bookstore there. So, of course, obviously the 2 biggest months for sales are November and December. Everyone knows that. But the 3rd biggest month for people buying my books from backyardhistory.ca is January. And I can't help but think that's because the people on your Christmas list secretly want that book for Christmas, but they aren't getting them. So don't disappoint your loved ones this Christmas and order them a book from backyardhistory.ca today.
You're listening to Backyard History, the hidden stories that happened in your own backyard, the podcast version of the weekly history column running in newspapers across the Maritimes, with your host and author, Andrew McLean.
For a full year, everyone thought Alan Speer was dead. Reports said his Spitfire, that's a nimble British fighter plane, had been shot down over northern Africa in 1942, and then the 24-year-old from Bathurst had been killed by an Italian ace pilot.
The young Bathurst airman was most popular and well known in the town. He was an employee of the Woodlands Division of the Bathurst Power and Paper Co. for a number of years before enlisting in the Royal Canadian Air Force,
wrote the Moncton Daily Times. Soon after, Fredericton's Daily Gleaner newspaper claimed that it had
obtained additional facts through roundabout sources.
And by roundabout sources, they meant from a pilot from Miami, Florida, with the implausible name of Rusty Gates. Now, this rather ridiculously named American pilot had clearly not gotten that memo about the famous Second World War slogan, "Loose lips sink ships," which of course means service members shouldn't talk about ongoing operations with anyone, especially reporters. Actually, I don't even think the Army even specifically told service members not to talk to the press, because they should have been able to figure that one out on their own. But not Rusty Gates, who confidently told this reporter from Fredericton exactly what had happened that day to the Bathurst fighter pilot. Rusty Gates explained that a flight of 6 Spitfires flown by Canadians had taken off for a mission above Libya in northern Africa. Among them were 3 pilots from New Brunswick. Their names were Kenneth Bissett and Bert Miller. Both of them were from Campbellton. And there was Alan Speer, who was from Bathurst. These 3 pilots had long been friends. They had all gotten together in Bathurst one day, years before. They had gone to the recruiting office together, and these 3 friends had enlisted together to go to war. On that flight, all 3 of these New Brunswickers were ambushed by several ace pilots from the Italian Air Force while they were deep over enemy lines. These 3 men were shot down, and all of these 3 New Brunswicker boyhood friends were killed. Rusty Gates told the reporter,
"They've paid the supreme sacrifice and were reported dead after air operations. The Canucks from Bathurst were friends of mine. We were in there doing our part."
So, that's the end of the story now, right? Tragic ending, to be sure, but it's all a very familiar one. This is especially familiar for the little pulp and paper town of Bathurst. Their one weekly newspaper, which was called the Northern Light, tried to be really, really optimistic as the war's anniversary hit 3 years. This little newspaper took it upon itself to bestow Bathurst with the rather grandiose nickname.
The only bright light left in the world.
More dedicated Backyard History podcast listeners might remember that the Northern Light newspaper was featured in the episode called Moscow to Miscou, in which the newspaper's editor, Cyril Merzero, assembled the most bizarre crew of people imaginable to set off on a late-night adventure to track down 2 Soviet pilots from Moscow who crashed on isolated Miscou Island. But for all of its determined efforts to stay optimistic, the war was still deeply affecting Bathurst, and it was still deeply affecting that newspaper too. That main character. In our Moscow to Miscou episode, the newspaper editor, Cyril Merzero, had gone off to fight in the Second World War. And Cyril Merzero was killed in that war. Practically every issue of the Northern Light had a photo on the front page of a smiling young soldier in uniform, and under it, with the same grim headline,
Local boy killed in action.
So everyone thought this was the end of Alan Speer, too. Several months later, in the spring of 1943, in a prisoner of war camp in Italy, an Ontarian named Reg Parmenter made an unusual request to one of the Italian guards who were keeping an eye on him when he's a prisoner in this camp. Really, it wasn't just one strange request. This was like a whole series of completely ridiculous requests for a prisoner of war to make of a prison guard. He asked this Italian guard to bring a camera to work, to take his photo in the prisoner of war camp, which, needless to say, is a restricted area, to get this photo developed for him, and then to mail this photo of him in the prison camp to his family in Canada so that they could see for themselves that he was safe and sound. Now, I don't think that I even need to explain that this violates many rules. This violates, like, all of the rules. It was an insane request for a prisoner of war to make from a prison guard, and it was even more insane that this soldier from fascist Italy actually did it. But wait, this guard had an idea to make this even better. He didn't just take a photo of Reg Parmenter by himself, but he took a picture of him and 11 of his friends, all prisoners of war, all in the camp, so that their families too, back in Canada, could know they were all right. And somehow, the Italian censors let this photo slip through and get home to Canada. So this photo arrives at Reg Parmenter's parents' house. They see he's okay. They've got no idea who these other 11 guys are, so they send the photo to the press. The photo gets published across Canada, and soon families recognize their sons. They were soldiers from Ottawa, Toronto, St. Mary's, St. Thomas, Brantford, and all of them had been captured near Tobruk, in Libya. Except for one man. In the back row, slouched and tiny in the frame, was a lone pilot. Not a soldier, not from Ontario. For the longest time, nobody recognized him. It was, after all, the kind of bad photo that only a mother would recognize her son in. And that is exactly what happened. Jane Nelson Speer saw this photo and recognized the 12th prisoner as her son, Alan, who had been reported dead months before.
There is no doubt to Jane Speer that one of the 12 is Pilot Officer Alan Speer of Bathurst, her only son,
announced the Northern Light newspaper. Jane Speer had moved back to her hometown of Sussex shortly after Alan's death had been announced. Her husband, Joseph, who was a Nova Scotian traveling salesman who sold cookies, had died, and Alan, her only son, had been her sole remaining tie in Bathurst. She desperately tried to reach her son through the Red Cross, but even they came up empty. Finally, in August, the Italian government admitted that Alan Speer was indeed a prisoner, but in a rather suspicious move, they refused to let the Red Cross see him. So Jane knew that her son was alive because she saw a photo. And she knew he was alive because the Italians said he was a prisoner. But they wouldn't let the Independent Red Cross confirm this and check up how he was actually doing. None of this is exactly what you would call a good sign, especially if you're a parent and this is your only son we're talking about, and he'd already been reported as dead.
Months of anxiety for his relatives and loved ones followed,
wrote the Northern Light, because clearly something was very wrong. This newspaper occasionally updated readers that
Jane was enduring several months of anxiety in suspense.
Then, only 2 weeks before Christmas, Jane heard a knock on her door. She opened it and she found the most dreaded of all visitors for a parent with a child off fighting in war. It was the RCIF's casualty officer, a man whose job it was to deliver the worst of news. This time, however, things were different. In a genuinely shocking twist, the casualty officer had come to deliver good news.
Alan Speer is now reported safe.
Jane Speer told the Northern Light newspaper.
The happy news amounts to the most wonderful Christmas present I could ever hope to get.
2 days later, though, Jane received another knock on the door. It was the casualty officer again. He explained that he regretted to inform her there had been a grave mistake. Alan Speer was not, in fact, in a prisoner of war camp in Italy after all. Alan Speer was in New Brunswick. He had just disembarked from a ship in St. John. It turned out that Alan Speer had escaped from the Italian prisoner of war camp and was home for Christmas.
Another hero of World War II arrived in Bathurst in the person of Alan Speer, and a proud mother was finally able to welcome home her son after weeks of anxious waiting.
Much to the Northern Lights' immense frustration, though, they found that Alan Speer refused to talk to them about how he'd escaped and how he'd managed to make it home just in time for Christmas. All the newspaper said was,
He, along with several other airmen, made their way out of enemy-occupied territory and, after many exciting experiences, finally came into contact with the Allies.
Alan Speer had all the markings of a national war hero. It was the kind of story that would have made him a household name in Canada, especially around Christmas time where so many families' sons were fighting in Italy. But he carefully dodged reporters when he was home that Christmas, and he stayed silent about his ordeal. It turned out that he stayed silent not because it was an excessively traumatic event, that he couldn't bring himself to speak of it. It really wasn't. The way he told the whole story, it was barely an inconvenience to have escaped. But he stayed silent because he was all too aware that he might become famous, and he definitely didn't want that. So we are only able to piece the story together decades later when a then 77-year-old Alan Speer finally consented to doing an interview with Bathurst author A.J. McCarthy. Obviously, McCarthy's first question was why hadn't Alan Speer talked about the story earlier? And Speer said,
I never wanted to achieve the wartime status of a Billy Bishop or any other Canadian flying ace.
It turned out that the story that had been told by the American pilot with the implausible name of Rusty Gates had not been, strictly speaking, accurate. While there had in fact been a dramatic dogfight between some Italian pilots and his two friends from Campbellton, Alan Speer had not been a part of this. He had actually been long gone on that flight earlier than that, and what took him out was something much more mundane than a fight between airplanes. His engine had overheated and seized up. He said that as he flew in one of these 6 Spitfires in formation, his inexperienced flight leader had ordered a rapid ascent.
The intense heat was the problem. The engine got too hot and couldn't take the steep climb. Suddenly, I noticed my engine had seized. The propeller was just sitting there, looking at me. The throttle was wide open. The switches were on, but there was nothing I could do.
He made an emergency belly landing in a Spitfire as 5 other pilots flew off into the distance without him. He was far behind enemy lines. It took mere minutes for the German Nazis to arrive on the scene and take him prisoner. The Germans took him to a makeshift camp in an open desert. It was nothing but fenced-in area with the remains of a few destroyed trucks in it. He and the other prisoners were left there for 2 days before being moved to a coastal port. There was no food, and Alan Speer remembered that the temperature during that time when they were out in the open sun rose to 49 degrees Celsius.
We were so thirsty, we drank from the radiator of an abandoned truck.
They were eventually transported to a port where he and some 3,000 Allied prisoners were packed into an overcrowded and unsanitary ship to be transported to camps in Italy. Alan Speer summed up the entire experience in a single word:
Gruesome.
The ship arrived in Rome, and they were moved to a prisoner of war camp on the outskirts of the Italian capital. That famous photo, taken by the Italian Guard, wasn't part of any secret plot to get sensitive information to Canada. Everything was exactly as silly as it sounded. Reg Parmenter genuinely just wanted a group photo taken, and the extent of the thought that this Italian Guard had put into the whole thing was the more the merrier. Not long after the group photo was taken, Alan Speer, along with 2 fellow prisoners, Rod Hughes and Bob Firth, escaped. In Alan Speer's own opinion, and I really want to emphasize here that he is ridiculously modest about all of this, he firmly believes that the whole thing is barely worth mentioning. Italy was, by the time they escaped the prison of war camp, in a state of collapse, so the way he told it, it hadn't really been a tough escape. The 3 men had simply pretended to be Red Cross workers who were transporting items in the camp. So they basically just picked up boxes of food and blankets, and they just confidently walked out of the camp pretending it was their job to transport goods. And the Italian guards didn't even stop them to ask them questions. So, suddenly free from this prison camp, the 3 escaped prisoners' goal was to make their way to the south of Italy, where the Canadian Army was fighting its way north. What the 3 men faced ahead of them was the kind of epic overland hike like you'd find in The Lord of the Rings. Or at least, that's how the story could have been told by someone who was less modest than Alan Speer. In his version of events, though, this big hike through enemy territory from a prison camp toward a war zone was, once again, barely an inconvenience. It turned out that even if Italy was at war with Canada, the Italian civilian population was very much in support of Canada, and they were more than willing to help these 3 Canadians who'd escaped from a prisoner of war camp to make it south towards the war zone.
We had no fear of being turned in by the Italians.
So while the Italians were very kind and helpful to the Canadians, they had another problem. The Germans flooded Italy with reinforcements to shore up the rapidly collapsing ally. This, for Alan Speer, was a frightening development, because he said,
The Germans wouldn't hesitate to recapture us or shoot us.
Suddenly, the journey through Italy became a lot more difficult than being transported from home to home by friendly Italian civilians. Now they were forced off the roads by the presence of elite German troops crossing the Italian countryside on their way to go fight against the Canadian Army. Very soon it became too perilous for these 3 escaped Canadian prisoners of war to continue making it south. They headed away from the roads into the Italian foothills.
We found a cave for shelter and ate raw potatoes to survive.
The 3 escaped prisoners continued to call this cave home as the summer ended and the autumn began. With every passing night, the temperature fell lower and lower. It soon became clear that they would have to leave the safety of their cave. They would have to brave the threat of German patrols to try and sneak south in order to find their fellow Canadians before they froze in the coming winter. The 2 men risked leaving their cave. They slipped past German patrols until, at last, they finally stumbled into the path of the rapidly advancing Canadians. Again, you'd probably think that we could tell the story as one of an epic tale of crawling across enemy lines and avoiding literal Nazis in enemy territory. But of course, this isn't how Alan Speer told it. In his typical modesty, he told it like they were just out for a stroll, completely oblivious to anything when the entire Canadian army just happened to find them. The reason that Alan Speer tried telling the stories in this modest way was because he genuinely didn't feel that there was anything heroic about the war. And that was an evolution of thought that he'd come to after escaping and after all of the experiences with the Italian civilians. And he said,
Right after the war, we were still glorifying it. But now, when I think about the war, it isn't anything to do with glory. One time I used to wish I had shot a lot of Germans down, but now I'm glad I didn't.
Alan Speer was keenly aware that not every story ended as his had. For countless other Canadians who'd been in the war zone, there had been no Christmas reunion. There was no knock on the door with good news, and there was no sudden appearance only 2 weeks before Christmas. For a lot of Canadians, there was only the quiet absence of friends and neighbors who had gone overseas to fight in the war and never came back.
I tend to remember only the good times now. For a while, I remembered the names and faces of the men I knew who were killed, but memories fade. When we reminisce about the war years, the only thing I regret now is the friends I've lost.
That was Backyard History with your host, Andrew McLean. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for another hidden story that happened in your own backyard. Produced by Jordan Lozier.